This
Oh my
is
God is right.
All right. Yeah, so
Well played, Stephen.
yeah, I'm pretty proud of this one. Um, so keeping up with some of our fun titles, today we're going to be talking about UEC's blend of 11 herps and spices, which is, of course, our recipe for herpetoculture. I'll talk a little bit more about what this is because obviously probably unfamiliar to a lot of you. So we're going to be talking a little bit about history, future, where things are headed with herpetoculture, some ethics of it, and then also its role in research and conservation. So what is herpetoculture? So it's just sort of the fancy term for the keeping of live reptiles and amphibians in captivity, and that can be for someone who just does it as a hobby, or it could be like a commercial breeding operation or like a zoo or something like that. And then herptiles or herps, some people shorten it to that, is just the combination of both reptiles and amphibians into one. So I'm going to give you sort of a brief, concise history starting all the way back from the first records of keeping reptiles and amphibians up until more recent, but there's a whole bunch that I'm going to leave out for the sake of time. That actually is a pretty complicated history. Um, so the earliest and like ancient records are pretty few and far between, but the earliest records came from about Egypt, circa 2500 BC. Um, Emperors and monarchs were depicted in like drawings and paintings, keeping crocodiles and cobras, and is mostly a symbol of status and wealth, and that's going to be a consistent theme um, throughout most of the ancient history. So this spread into Babylonian and Persian regions, potentially around 2000 BC, and often rulers would send other rulers gifts, exotic gifts, and this would often include exotic animals like crocodiles and snakes. So that's sort of how this very early idea of keeping reptiles and amphibians spread. So there's similar happenings like this in the Egypt region and sort of Middle East region. There's a similar uh, thing happening around China around 1150 BC, and with similar reasonings with people wanting exotic uh, animals as symbols of their wealth and power. Greece and Rome were the next to come after those two. The Greeks having mainly private collections. This is sort of different than most other places. They use them to study, and this is often where the first written information for many species came from, and many of which were reptiles. The Romans imported a variety of animals for fights in the Colosseum, and it's often included like giant crocodiles and large snakes and stuff, and they kept them in large areas called vivaria. So they weren't necessarily keeping them for good, but they were in fact keeping them. And then also the Aztecs on the other side of the world often used snakes, and because of that, they often kept a lot of snakes. Um, and many of them were even used as sacrifices to their gods, which is pretty interesting. Moving forward, jumping past ancient history stuff. So the first established by King John in the 1200s was the Royal Menagerie. This is sort of our first zoo, or what we would consider a zoo sort of thing. Um, and this existed for until 1835, and each subsequent ruler would take over. And this place housed all sorts of animals. They had lions and uh, elephants, but also they had a large collection of reptiles. This included crocodiles and snakes. And it's even rumored that they had a collection of over 100 rattlesnakes. Um, the menagerie eventually deteriorated over time. Obviously, it was there for hundreds and hundreds of years. Um, and when it deteriorated, the collection of animals was sort of spread out into these newly established zoological societies. So the Zoological Society of London started, and they started taking animals, and then they distributed the rest to other groups that are popping up here and there. They also are unaware of where the collection of over 100 rattlesnakes went. So that's interesting. Um, so there's a whole bunch of other things that like organizations and groups that pop up here and there of like the first group that did this with this reptile and the first group that did this, but um, herptiles became, instead of moving away from symbols of being uh, symbols of power and wealth that people originally were keeping them as. They became more popular among common people. Reptiles are starting to spread across the world. Reptile shows were becoming more popular, and more people were becoming familiar with the idea of keeping reptiles and amphibians, and people wanted to keep them for themselves. This sort of began a not so nice part of herptile keeping history. A lot of people um, would collect reptiles from the wild to keep as pets. There was a whole lot of mistreating, long shipping across the world, improper care, killing. Um, but it's a whole lot of years of just trial and error, essentially, which cost the lives of a lot of animals. But it's not all necessarily doom and gloom. It also provided very valuable information of how to keep the animals properly. There was like a story of a guy who had a chameleon and he had it for a month and he started studying it. And he was like, oh, it changes colors when it is feeling certain ways. And he learned bits of care and then it would die, which obviously isn't good. But then he'd figure out what he did wrong. And then he got another chameleon, kept it alive longer, learned more about it, and established these standards for care and starting to collect information about different reptiles and amphibians. Um, the first, it all like building off of that of this information, the first record activity, which is going to be an important theme moving forward. There was in 1860. There were actually painted turtles, which we have in Wisconsin, which is pretty cool. And that was the first record of breeding reptiles in captivity, which is important information that people also gathered along the way. Something interesting in 1897, the first herpetological book in English was published by Gregory C. Bateman, which is pictured on the slides, was called The Vivarium. And it's kind of interesting because when you look through the book, obviously this was written a very long time ago, but it's very reminiscent of what we are sort of used to today. He had a lot of very like progressive ideas of how to keep live plants. He had cool, interesting water heating methods to help heat enclosures for different animals. He um, created entire systems of like waterfalls and etc. to keep that are very similar to what we do today, but obviously this was a very long time ago and it was very new for the time and the first document of someone doing that. So skipping ahead past that, we're going to move into more recent history, not totally recent, but as more and more people become interested in keeping reptiles, and there's a very growing popularity to keep reptiles. It's no longer just for the wealthy. There was this big initial enthusiasm for people that wanted to keep reptiles, many of which kept in basic setups, which people didn't understand at the time. It was still so new that people didn't realize what it takes to keep reptiles. So there's this very limited knowledge of what to do to keep different reptiles and amphibians. There's also very limited resources since it's so new. There's not um, specialized resources and materials to build enclosures that are adequate for these animals. And similarly, like early on, there's still a lot of field collection of reptiles and amphibians, which really isn't good. It's very bad for wild populations. There's a lot of health concerns when you take wild animals into captivity. There's a lot of behavioral things that can go wrong. Overall, not very good. That it's pictured on the left. There's very basic enclosures, but people thought it was okay at the time. And that was the general consensus: was it's very easy. Like all you need is a glass tank with a piece of paper towel on the bottom and a light, and your reptile will be just fine. People were focused more about how can we keep a reptile, or how can reptiles survive in captivity versus how can it thrive and actually get the care that it needs to have a good life. So that's sort of where we came from, and this was sort of perpetuated by these big firms that sort of tried to capitalize on this limited knowledge. They started to push out their own sort of brands and their own materials, but they weren't necessarily adequate because there was still such limited knowledge. So big like Petco and PetSmart at the time, there was still so limited knowledge that they were like, oh yeah, you can keep dozens of leopard geckos together at a time and they'll be just fine. It's like that, as long as they survived, it was okay. And they also created a lot of care guides that had inaccurate information. This has sort of changed more recently as there's been growing awareness. But this is sort of in like early 90s and stuff like that, when people were just starting to get into these big companies sort of perpetuated these poor reptile and amphibian keeping practices. But it's not necessarily all bad. Like I've sort of painted this picture that a lot of people were um, having poor care and etc. But there's a whole lot of very valuable information that came from that, which is shapes the future of where we're headed, which I think is much more um, hopeful. There was also a lot of community building at the time, sort of herpetological like groups, reptile like expos, where people could come together, share information, get to know each other in the community of keeping reptiles and amphibians. And that's very valuable because it helps move forward, and people who were successful keeping reptile or what does well, they can share that information with each other, and it helps to um, push the hobby in a way that is better for the animals. There's also a lot of contributions to science, especially in veterinary fields. Reptiles and amphibians often kind of get the short end of the stick when it comes to vets, because most people uh, studying veterinary sciences are more focused on mammals or more common animals. But as um, people started to keep more reptiles and amphibians, it's forcing veterinary science to become familiar with their care and become more familiar with different diseases um, and reptile amphibian related care that's becoming very valuable and helping us learn a lot more about these animals and how to keep them healthy and what's important about them. And there's also this evolution of standards. People started to realize with all of this that the conditions that they were using aren't necessarily the best, and there's better ways to do it, which is where we're headed. So more so today, there's this much bigger awareness of keeping reptiles and amphibians in an ethical manner, or um, a different way than what we are used to. And this is mainly um, driven by the easy access of information with like social media, and you can just Google any information that you want at any time. And it's much easier to get the correct information. Um, so there's this changing dynamic within reptile and amphibian keeping to create what's called like bioactive enclosures or more naturalistic enclosures. I'll get into this whole what that means in a second, but it's a higher standard of care to try and recreate natural environments for captive reptile amphibians to create a higher standard of living for them. Like I said, there's a whole lot of community influence, people posting YouTube videos or online care guides or just their own experiences with their animals that help build this database of information of what works well and what doesn't. There's also a whole lot more commercial availability. There's all sorts of you can get. There's very easy access to the correct materials. You can get them online and shipped to your door by the next morning. All sorts of educational resources, like I said, YouTube videos, online care guides, etc. There's many more ethical considerations that people are taking into account, which we'll also get into later on. And then even more of this hobbyist contribution to science, increasing veterinary care, increasing research on captive animals, captive breeding projects, etc. So here's just sort of these side by side of where we sort of came from with keeping reptiles and amphibians in captivity, and then also these newer standards of naturalistic enclosures, higher standards of care, etc. So diving deeper into this concept of a bioactive or naturalistic enclosure, I'll dive into the components of what makes something bioactive, what makes it, what are the benefits of it, etc. So starting off with substrate, the substrate is obviously the base of what everything else is built off of for a bioactive enclosure for a reptile or an amphibian. It consists of a few different parts. So we have the drainage layer, which goes along the bottom for excess water to drain into, so the bottom doesn't turn into mud. The soil layer, which is often mixes of different soil components to accommodate for each type of animal. This could be cocoa fiber, peat moss, soil, sand, charcoal, bark, etc. That's all different mixes of those together create different environments for each type of animal. And then there's also leaf litter on top, which is a component of nearly all um, ecosystems, is some sort of organic matter that covers the top that provides function for the bioactive enclosure. So I'll get into the live plants grow in the soil, and then there's bugs that eat the leaf litter, returning nutrients to the substrate, and then the nutrients get used by the plants for growth. It's a very complex system that is all centers around the substrate. There's also live plants, like I mentioned. So depending on the type of animal you have, there's very different live plants you get. If you have tropical animals like this dart frog here, you might use tropical plants to help recreate their natural environment. There's all sorts of benefits to that. It creates a naturalistic look. It creates an enriching environment for the animals. Can exhibit natural behaviors in captivity. They can hide in plants. Different plants provide different function. For example, bromeliads create cups of water that the animals can use to drink out of, or that they can hide in. They they use the nutrients from the soil to grow and create a dynamic environment that's changing as the plants grow. It creates different places for the animals to go and different microhabitats within the enclosure. And then there's also maintenance associated with plants. Obviously, as some grow too big, they outgrow the space. You can trim them back, or you can change out plants to create a changing environment for the animal. One of I think the coolest parts of bioactive enclosures, and what a lot of people think makes a bioactive enclosure bioactive, is microfauna. So the animal isn't necessarily the only thing living in the enclosure. You're trying to recreate a natural ecosystem to the best of your ability within enclosed space, which obviously will never reach the point of a fully self-sustaining ecosystem, but you can get pretty darn close. So some of these microfauna that you might introduce into an enclosure to help create more naturalistic cycles are springtails, isopods, millipedes, which I have pictured on the side here. And they're very important to keeping the enclosure clean. A lot of people call these the cleanup crew. So they break down waste as the animal produces waste, or there's leftover food, or they shed skin. It drops into the substrate, and these animals take care of that, or play a role at least in helping to clean that up. Springtails in particular control mold. Obviously, when you have live plants, you're watering them, it creates an environment that mold wants to grow in. And obviously a mold outbreak is not good for an animal, but the springtails come along to eat the mold, to control that, and to create a clean environment for the animal. The isopods and millipedes, they eat the leaf litter, returning nutrients to the substrate, and they also dig around the soil, aerating it and maintaining the soil health. And that's why it reduces the need for substrate changes, which is reducing cost for hobbyists or people like in zoos. And it's very dynamic and keeps the ecosystem going for the reptile amphibian you're keeping. This could be a whole backyard naturalist on its own. There's all sorts of people who maybe started with reptiles and amphibians and then learned about different cleanup crews or different insects that they can keep. And it's become a whole hobby of its own. So there's all sorts of different kinds that people get into and breed, and there's all sorts of varieties available. One in particular that a lot of people are in search of is these rubber ducky isopods in the top left corner. They're quite cute. But there's a million types of varieties that people can get that they keep along with reptiles and amphibians. Other components of bioactive and what makes them good for the animals is lighting. So there's all sorts of different kinds of lighting depending on the animal. UVB lighting, which helps mimic what animals get from the sun in a captive space. It helps them work through the minerals and nutrients of what they're eating, helps them process those within their body. Full spectrum LED lighting helps illuminate enclosures, provide day-night cycles for the animals, keeping them with natural cycles in their body. and also provides light for the plants to grow. And then heat lamps also provide different thermal gradients for the animals to self-regulate their body temperature. Obviously, many reptiles and amphibians are cold-blooded, so they need outside heat to help regulate their body temperature. So having hot sides of an enclosure and cool sides of the enclosure, so the animal can choose these different microhabitats to regulate their body temperature, are all parts of the bioactive enclosure and recreating different elements that would be in an actual ecosystem in the wild. And then also there's this whole making it aesthetically pleasing and making it similar to how things look in the wild. So there's all sorts of different ways to create custom backgrounds or different water features or creating naturalistic decor. People make custom backgrounds out of foam and paint them to look like rocks and rock ledges for animals to climb on. People get driftwood, cork bark for animals to hide and climb on. People create very complex enclosures that have waterfalls, and in part that has a water section for animal to swim in, but also has a land section with plants and things to climb on. It's a very intricate and very creative process. Obviously, nature is fairly unpredictable, and you can't recreate it exactly, but to each enclosure, you can tailor it to each animal in a creative way to make it the best for them and to make it visually appealing and very enriching for the animal. So in the end, it helps create these they're super cool enclosures. They're very unique, they're very naturalistic, and they're very enriching for the animals. This has health benefits for the animals. They can exhibit more natural behaviors. They can hunt for their own food. They can climb on branches. They can burrow in soil. It improves health and quality of life for the animal, but it also has a lot of benefits for the person keeping them. It reduces maintenance. You don't have to change out substrate. It controls itself. Um, a lot of people get automatic misting systems to create different, to create like rain within the enclosure to keep the enclosure moist, and have timers for their lighting. It is very self-maintaining, so it's good for the hobbyist as well as for the animal. So relating this back to the UEC, Maggie mentioned a little bit about some of the stuff I've been doing at the UEC. So this was the first enclosure that we updated at the Urban Ecology Center for Peanut and Emily, which are our ornate box turtles. As well, Emily is a different type of box turtle. But so this is one sort of before and after. We sort of had our own transition from old standards of care to these new bioactive standards. So I have a few photos of me taking this enclosure home in my car and working on a custom foam background, which I then created to hopefully look like a rocky background. And I'm sure as much of the research team can attest, we've seen lots of different behaviors from Peanut and Emily, our box turtles, within this new enclosure versus what it was. And similarly, just yesterday, we set up a new enclosure for Edward, which I think everyone should take a moment to appreciate Edward because he's adorable. He's our tiger salamander. So his old enclosure pictured in the top left, and then his new enclosure in the top right, which has a water section as salamanders are semi-aquatic. So he has a pool to swim in with a little waterfall, and then he also has much thicker substrate for him to burrow in. He has logs to hide under live plants, ferns and mosses, which are very similar to what we would see in the wild. And sort of the goals and purpose of why we're trying to do this at the Urban Ecology Center, we're trying to, first of all, increase our standard of care for our animals. We obviously care very much about our animals, and we want them to have the best quality of life. So we're trying to give them that with these new standards. But also there's a whole bunch of other benefits. We're trying to, obviously the Urban Ecology Center is an environmental education place. And with our old enclosures, we sort of just had the animal, and that was what we could teach about. But when we tried to replicate their natural environment, there's much more we can talk about within natural ecosystems that we can teach to many, what our main focus is children, and we have lots of programming centered around children, but it's also very valuable for adults. We can teach about different cycles within ecosystems. We can talk about nutrient cycling. We can talk about insects being detritivores and breaking organic matter down. There's a much higher educational capacity that you can teach about with these enclosures versus what the old standards could provide. It also decreases our maintenance. There's a higher investment cost to set up an enclosure like this. Obviously, there's more materials you need, but once you get it set up, you barely have to buy anything new for it once it's set up. So instead of buying new substrate every week or month, you don't have to do that anymore, and it saves money in the long run. So it also reduces our costs, and that's also very aesthetically pleasing. Obviously, people are going to want to come see this naturalistic enclosure versus the old enclosure. So I talked a lot about hobbyists, but there's also this whole other side of zoos and professional institutions that also do this. So there's a similar story that, like, obviously they had originally, it wasn't focused on animal care, it's more showcasing animals to the public. And it was very similar to hobbyists. They had very plain, like very plain enclosures that were just there to show off the animal, and that's it. But this is changing, similar to hobbies, as more information has become available and these standards are changing. Zoos are also adopting these naturalistic enclosures to show off more than just the animal and to improve their animal care. So their enclosures are getting upgrades similar to hobbyists. There's also lots more veterinary care within zoos because they have, on an individual level, hobbyists can take their reptiles and amphibians to vets, but it's more of a requirement for zoos. So zoos are, it's a necessity for them to keep their animals alive and healthy. So they have vets on call to do routine health checks, and this improves our knowledge of reptile amphibian care and how to care for them properly. And this is also driven by guidelines by professional associations like the American Zoo and Aquarium Association. So they can give zoos credentials when they have proper care for their animals. And this is driven to improve these standards for keeping reptiles and amphibians. Zoos also often have conservation efforts. They might have captive breeding programs or reintroduction programs for threatened reptiles and amphibians. They also have an educational role, which is very important to teach people about reptiles and amphibians. They also have research contributions, which is obviously important for us to learn more about these animals because they're very, in the grand scheme of animals, reptiles and amphibians often get less research done on them compared to others. So ethical considerations, I'm sure many of you are wondering, is it okay at all to keep reptiles and amphibians in captivity? Like, is this something that should be done? Should I support this? Is it okay? And there are definitely a lot of considerations to be taken into account. And I think it depends on, there's all sorts of factors that play into this, and it's on an individual level for you to make that decision for yourself. But some things that I think should be taken into consideration, and it's different for hobbyists and professional institutions. So for hobbyists, is the animal captive bred or wild caught? There's almost no circumstances for which a hobbyist should be taking an animal from the wild, unless they're very experienced and are trying to start a breeding project for an animal that is often taken from the wild, and to produce captive bred individuals to instead replace demand for that, which I'll talk about in a bit. So overall, hobbyists should not take an animal from the wild. If they buy a captive bred animal, that is a good start for ethical considerations. Also, if the hobbyist is capable of providing the proper care, a lot of people don't realize the amount of money, time, space, and knowledge that they need to take care of these animals. A lot of people might be under the false assumption that it's super easy to take care of reptiles and amphibians. A lot of people are like, oh yeah, just get it an enclosure and put some paper towel down and boom, you're done. But a lot of people, that's not the case. It takes much more. It takes lots of time, to get the knowledge to take care of them properly and to do it well. So, but if a person can do all those things and is ready to invest that time and money into an animal with the proper knowledge, and they have a captive bred animal, I think that that is enough ethical considerations for someone to keep it. It's a bit different for professional settings, especially in zoos. A lot of zoos have more access to animals that might be under more threats or at risk of extinction or something. So if they are taking these animals, of reptiles and amphibians, does the risk outweigh the reward? So sometimes they might be trying to preserve an endangered species or a species at risk of extinction. An example of this, not a reptile or amphibian, but the California condor, which is a bird. A zoo in California captured all of the remaining individuals in the wild. There are only like 30 or so individuals of this bird left. And then they started a captive breeding program to help preserve the species and eventually reintroduce them into the wild. So if the risk outweighs the reward for a certain animal, maybe it's okay. Also, many zoos have rehabilitation programs for animals that have been injured or can't survive in the wild. And maybe if the animal can't be released into the wild, it may be more ethically sound to keep that animal in captivity. Zoos also might have educational value. Maybe there's value in keeping an animal in captivity if you can use it to teach other people about it and its conservation efforts and the threats it's facing in the wild. Additionally, or similarly, does the keeping of the animal contribute to wild conservation and or research? Keeping animals in captivity is very beneficial to a lot of research institutions to learn more about how different things are affecting them, how to keep them, how to breed them, etc. And then also, is there proper care being provided? So just because it's a professional institution doesn't mean that they get to mistreat their animals. They should also be providing proper care, similar to hobbyists. So why is this all important? I've touched on a few things about reptiles and amphibians and why keeping them might be valuable to us. But what else is there? So 40.7% of amphibians and more than 20% of reptiles are threatened with extinction. So amphibians are the most threatened vertebrate class of animals. This is like mammals, birds, etc. Amphibians are the most threatened, and I think reptiles come in third. I think mammals are ahead of them. But either way, that is a lot of animals that are threatened with extinction. And these animals play very important roles in ecosystems. A lot of people might overlook that because they don't have showy conservation value to some other animals. For example, like a lot of insects, people are aware that bees serve as valuable pollinators and like, oh, we can't let the bees go extinct because all our plants will die. Or like a wolf, they're like, oh, it's the top predator. It keeps the deer population in check. They're very aware of the conservation value of keeping these different animals alive. But a lot of people don't recognize that for reptiles and amphibians because their value isn't as showy compared to other animals. They serve very important middle grounds within the food web, keeping smaller populations of insects and small mammals in check, but then also being valuable food for top predators and bigger things like birds, large mammals, etc. So their role in an ecosystem is extremely important, but is often overlooked. And they're also facing all sorts of threats. The biggest one to all animals and ecosystems and biodiversity in general is habitat loss. But this also affects amphibians and reptiles. So cutting down forests or degrading ecosystems with agriculture, cow pasture, mining, oil, all these are super bad for reptiles and amphibians to survive, obviously. In the bottom left, I've got a picture of a palm oil plantation. So palm oil is used in all sorts of foods. Like a bag of Doritos you ate the other day, palm oil. Palm oil, they clear cut entire sections of rainforest to have monocultures of this palm tree to produce palm oil. And this is obviously not good for reptiles and amphibians or any biodiversity in general, and some of the most valuable ecosystems on Earth. After habitat loss, climate change is obviously the next biggest risk to reptiles and amphibians. Amphibians in particular have very narrow environmental tolerances. They're very susceptible to change. They breathe through their skin. They need water. They have very narrow temperature requirements that they need to be in. And if any of that changes, they either need to move or they go extinct. And there's only so far they can go. They can either move northward or poleward or upward in altitude to um, maintain those narrow environmental conditions. And eventually they're going to run out of space. Um, Pollution, like I said, especially for amphibians, when they breathe through their skin, if water is polluted, they're the first to go. And that's why they're super valued indicator species of good water. If a place doesn't have amphibians that should, it's an indicator that their water is bad or polluted, or it can't support those wildlife. Disease, the chytrid fungus, which I hope many people are familiar with, is a fungus that is spreading throughout all sorts of amphibians, and it is killing frogs all over the world. So that's the picture in the top left here. Frogs are declining rapidly because of this fungus. And then also invasive species, I'm sure many of you are familiar with, especially in like Florida. There's a good example of Burmese pythons, green iguanas, and the Everglades outcompeting native species for these invasives that are taking over. And something I'm going to dive into a bit more and relates back to herpetoculture is illegal pet trade. So a lot of people want animals for pets, and can be sold for very rare species in particular, can be sold for very high amounts of money, and people collect them from the wild because this is bad for wild populations. So diving into that a bit more, like I said, there's high demand, and especially for rare, unique, or threatened species. So that's mostly why the illegal pet trade is banned, because it's disproportionately affecting the most threatened species. And also, this comes along with a lot of inhumane capture and transport. So even when they capture these species, they'll have to ship them across the world, often in poor conditions, and many die in transit, which they can't even get to the person to be kept as a pet. They are being captured for nothing. There's also very limited, and it's very difficult to regulate illegal capture of these animals. CITES, which is an illegal trade database that helps to regulate and manage illegal capture of animals. It's a good project. However, 75% of reptiles and 80% of amphibians that were found in exotic pet trades aren't even listed in CITES. So they're trying to regulate and manage that. However, there's so many within the legal pet trade that they can't regulate at all. There's also all sorts of legal loopholes that people can do that to ship in for even when animals might be illegal to keep. There's loopholes people can go through to keep them legally. So one thing people say is that as long as demand exists for reptiles and amphibians, illegal trafficking will exist. So that it's not necessarily going away. We're not going to be able to regulate it fully. There's always going to be some form if there's people willing to buy. But one thing that is becoming very promising is if we replace the source of the animal with a more sustainable and ethically sound option. So I think a very good example of this is I've studied abroad in Ecuador. This is my last spring semester, and I visited this place called Wikiri Sapo Parque. It's also in conjunction with the Jambatu Center, which is a amphibian research center in Quito, Ecuador. And one thing that they do is they have taken frogs from the wild, and they are producing them in a captive lab with proper care. So they've taken 15 at-risk native species and are producing them to outcompete poachers in the wild. They've also rediscovered the Jambatu frog, which was thought to be extinct in the wild, and are successfully breeding it in captivity and have release programs to help support the wild populations. They sell these frogs to proper institutions for distribution, and this decreases, like I said, demand for poachers, and the funds generated from those sales go towards further amphibian research and conservation. They do all sorts. There's lots of promise within frogs and reptiles in general for medicinal properties of antibiotics and antifungals. There's actually the Gila monster, which is a venomous lizard in the US. Its venom can be used in diabetes drugs to help lower sugar in our blood, which is pretty cool. And there's all sorts of more to be discovered and to be further researched. And also, the center leads educational tours about what they do and teaches people that they should not be taking animals from the wild. You should, if you are going to keep an animal, you should keep it with proper care and only buy captive bred animals. So I think that this is where the future is headed if we can have exclusively captive bred populations and then we can leave wild populations alone, and then hobbyists can still exist but in a more ethically sound and sustainable manner. So sort of wrapping up about herpetoculture and what it allows us to do. It allows rare species to persist in captivity even if they were to go extinct in the wild. This is often what a lot of zoos do. They have their own population of captively breeding animals to keep populations going. It helps us improve our understanding of reptile diseases in veterinary care. For example, the chytrid fungus, we can study that in captivity and produce solutions for wild populations, and also increasing veterinary care for hobbyists. We can study climatic effects on herps. Obviously, with climate change, we want to know how we can help. Pharmaceutical applications, like I just mentioned, there's all sorts of promising research with different pharmaceutical drugs and medicines that have been created from reptiles and amphibians. Also providing conservation practices to help those populations of some of the most threatened species on the planet. And also, keeping reptiles in captivity can help educate and change minds about herps. A lot of people have preconceived notions about reptiles and amphibians that they're slimy, scaly, mean, they'll bite you, they're poisonous, they're venomous, they're all these like bad trigger terms that people associate with reptiles and amphibians when that's not necessarily the case. So a lot of people kill snakes and frogs without a second thought. And I think a lot of people would change their minds when they find out that they serve very valuable roles and are some of the most threatened species in the world. So there's all sorts of diversity and value within these animals, and I think herpetoculture is a promising future for some of these animals to help us understand them better and protect them within the wild. If anyone has any further questions, I do this as a hobby myself. Obviously, we're working on it at the Urban Ecology Center, and I'd like to think I have a decent amount of knowledge on this, and if anyone has further questions, feel free to contact me. I also have an Instagram where I have posted videos and pictures of this stuff in the past. I've fallen off recently, but I'll get back into it. You can also feel free to contact me on there as well. Otherwise, yeah, thank you.